In our previous lessons, we've been covering how to create your own custom command in a Sublime Text plugin, and even how to use an input handler to interactively prompt the user for the arguments of said command when it executes. Commands allow you to define a custom action for a user to take, but there's a lot of plugin related things you might want to do that require you to not initiate a particular action, but react to something that has already been done. And the topic of today's lesson is covering the basics of how to do that as we cover an introduction to event listeners and Sublime Text plugins. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. Odan here. Welcome back to Plugin 101, the video course teaching you how to become a package and plugin author in Sublime Text. The topic of today's lesson is an introduction to Sublime Text Event Listeners, or Sublime Text Event Handlers. We sometimes use those two terms interchangeably. Now, we have covered in previous lessons the idea of defining our own custom commands by defining classes in our Sublime Text plugins and using input handlers in our plugins to perhaps interactively prompt the user for the arguments to said commands. But when all is said and done, what a command actually does is allow the user to explicitly take an action by taking an action of pressing a key, choosing a menu item, something of that nature. The flip side, the thing we're talking about today is defining an event listener, which allows you to define a reaction to a particular event. There are a lot of events that we can listen for, a lot of file-related events like knowing when a file has just been loaded, is about to be saved or has just been saved, about to be closed or has just been closed, whether it's been modified, if the cursor is moving around. We can detect if a command has just finished executing, if a command is about to start executing. We can even detect if a command is about to start executing and then change what arguments it was passed, or get Sublime to run a completely different command in its place. There are a lot of different events that we can respond to. And in fact, upcoming versions of Sublime Text that are currently in preview but not publicly available have even more events that will become available when those builds become available, allowing us to do things like know when new when new windows are being created, or when tabs are being moved between those windows, when projects are being loaded and saved, and all sorts of great stuff. So what we're going to be talking about in today's lesson is what an event listener actually is, how we might define one, how Sublime interacts with event listeners that have been created. And we're going to do that in this sort of overview fashion. In the upcoming lessons, what we're going to be covering is what the actual events are, because there are a lot of them. We don't want to cover them all in one lesson. And for that reason, if you haven't already done so, you might want to use the buttons down below to thumb, subscribe, and share. Ring the bell notification icon as those new lessons become available. You will be notified right away and you can jump in on the goodness. But for right now, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about what event listeners are, how we might define one inside of a Sublime Text plugin. In the same way that we define a command by creating a class that's a subclass of a very specific parent, or an input handler by creating a class that's a subclass of a very specific parent class, an event listener is also created by creating a class that is a subclass of a very specific parent. And when Sublime has finished loading the plugin, as it's sifting through all of the classes that were defined, it'll find ones that have command parent classes and it knows their commands. It'll find input handler classes that have input handler parents. It knows those are an input handler. When it sees a class that has an event listener parent class, then it knows that that class represents an event listener. It'll be set aside and used for that purpose. Now, that works the same as it does in commands and input handlers, but what's different is that the name of an input handler and a command class is important. The name of the class in a command becomes the name of the command that the class represents. And similarly, the name of the input handler class directly becomes the name of the argument that that input handler represents, unless you implement the name method to change it. An event listener is something that's reacting to events. It's not something that you explicitly need to interface with. So the name of the class doesn't matter. You'll see it informationally in some places like the console as plugins are loading, or perhaps even in the profile plugin report under Tools Developer Profile Plugin, so you can see how long different event handlers are taking to execute. But apart from that, the name is completely arbitrary and up to you. Now, and also in the same way that command classes generally have a suffix of command so that they're easier to distinguish, that's a convention but not strictly required. And event or input handlers have a suffix of input handler for the same reason. It's not strictly required, but it makes it easier to detect that that class is an input handler. Event listeners generally have a suffix of listener or event listener on the end of their name, which is a convention, not strictly required. You can name the class whatever you want, but it does make it easier when you're looking through your code, say with GoToAnything, or when you share your code with another plugin author and they're becoming familiar with your code, that the name of the class defines what role it actually carries out in the package, which is something that may be interesting. And another similarity shared with things like commands and input handlers is that all of the various events that an event listener can trigger for are implemented by methods inside of the class. There's a predefined set of methods that represent all of the different events that can trigger. If you want to handle a particular event, you implement the method. If you don't care about that event, you don't have to implement that particular method at all. And apart from those, if you need to add any other methods in there, say to refactor code to share it between different events, or just any sort of general support classes, support code, you can add extra methods to that class in any way you see fit. It's only the ones with very specific names that Sublime considers to be special. In the same way that there are multiple types of commands that you can create and multiple types of input handlers you can create, there are multiple types of event listeners you can create as well. So we have here an example plugin that has two event listeners, one of each of the two types. And much like the example of commands and input handlers, the different types of event listeners share a common set of methods. One of them has more methods than the other, but more on that in just a moment. But apart from a few small key differences that we're going to outline just now, anything that we say about an event listener generally applies the same to both of these particular types of thing. The first thing to mention is, of course, that we define them by creating a class. The name of the class doesn't matter because Sublime's going to be the one that's responsible for creating instances of it, and it's going to call methods when it thinks it needs them. So you don't need to worry about what the name of the class actually is. The first one, subclasses from Sublime plugin.EventListener. That makes this an event listener. We might refer to this as a global event listener. Usually when someone talks about an event listener, they're talking about this particular class. Now, this class has a large list of methods that it supports, one for each of the events. And this is a good time to point out again that there are a large multitude of events, with even more coming in upcoming builds of Sublime. We're not going to be covering that in this particular lesson. Those are going to be in some upcoming lessons, the majority of all of the events and what they're for and when you would use them. So do avail yourself of those buttons down below to thumb, subscribe, share, ring the bell notification icon. When those videos become available, you will have that particular information. Here, we're just concerned more about how we define one of these and the logic of how they work. And then with that under your belt, it's a lot easier to determine which one you might want and what events you're going to need for what it is that you're doing. Now, this first one has two methods in here, the onNew method and the onModified method. That represents two different events. OnNew triggers whenever a new buffer is created, and onModified is triggered whenever a modification is made. You'll notice that both of these events take a view as an argument. That's to tell you what file is new or what file was modified, which is important information for something like this. Now, we refer to these as a global event listener because this will globally trigger for any and all events. And that is to say that if you need to do any filtering of an event, if you only care about certain ones or only at certain times, you have to do that yourself. This goes a couple of different ways. First, if you never care about an event, then you just don't implement the method. For example, there's an onLoad method that would represent the onLoad event that tells you when a file is loaded. If you don't care about that, you don't implement the method. It never gets called. You have completely filtered it away. The flip side of that is an event where you always want it to trigger. For example, the onNew event, which triggers whenever a new file is created. If you care whenever a new buffer has been created, then you would implement this method. Then you'll know anytime any new buffer is created anywhere in any window across Sublime. The middle ground between those two is, what if you only sometimes care? For example, our onModified method, which represents the onModified event, which tells you when a buffer has been modified. If you only want to know when certain types of files are modified or some other particular situation, then you need to filter that yourself manually, because this method will trigger for any modification made to any buffer anywhere throughout the whole of Sublime. If you only care about certain things, for example, this one only cares about modifications to a Python file, then you need to filter that yourself manually. And we're doing that in this case by using ViewMatchSelector to make sure that the scope of this file matches source.python. And as a plug for other videos on the channel, if you're not sure what scopes are and how they work, there's a video for that. We generally don't cover that in these videos because it's a pretty large topic to talk about in general. So with this sample event listener up here, on new, every time a new buffer is created, assign it the syntax Python. So as you might expect, anytime a new buffer is created, it becomes a Python file. So for example, as a Python developer, you generally say always want to have your new files be Python files. I open a new tab. If we look down in the corner of the window or use the scope pop-up, this is a source.python file because of that event. Normally it would be a plain text file. Similarly, onModified is an event that triggers, as I said, whenever a file is modified. We're here making sure that this is a Python file, and if it is, we pop up the dialog box that says, hey, modified a Python file. So this is a Python file. If I push space, we get the dialog box that says modified a Python file. If we wanted to filter that out, we could, for example, jump into the command palette, change the syntax of this to something else, say HTML. Now, when I push space, the event doesn't seem to trigger. Actually, it is triggering. OnModified is being called for every modification made everywhere, but the code only proceeds through if it's actually a Python file. So you would use an event listener in this particular case if you want to trigger all events or perhaps most events. And sometimes if there's something that you need to filter, this can get in the way a little bit. The other type of event listener that we can create is the second example in this particular file, and that is the ViewEventListener. Now, again, the name of this class doesn't matter because Sublime is not, Sublime's going to be the one managing it and not us. What makes this different from the other class is that whereas Sublime creates exactly one instance of event listener because it's just going to globally get all events, for a view event listener, there's one instance of it created for every view to which that listener applies. And that view is available inside of the self.view property, the same as you might see it in a text command, because the text command has one instance created for every view and it knows what view it's associated with. A view event listener has the exact same thing. So you might notice that the onClose method here doesn't have a view argument. That's because it doesn't need it. OnClose is in this view event listener. That means it already knows what view is being closed because it was invoked inside of the instance for that particular view. Now, in order for this to work, there's a little bit of extra stuff that's happening behind the scenes here. The first is this class method is applicable. Now, what does this mean? This is Sublime's way of asking us as a class, do you apply in a certain situation? And we can say yes, or we can say no. And this isn't called just once. We can see here, this is called with the settings object that applies to a particular view. And remember, views can have a setting set by the defaults. They can have settings set by project settings. They can have settings set in syntax-specific settings. There can even be view-specific settings that override. If you're unfamiliar with how settings work, there's a video on the channel that covers that in detail as well. All of those are combined together into one settings object. It's passed to this method so that you can say if you apply or not. Anytime a setting changes inside of that object, this method will be called again to see if you apply now when you didn't before, if you still apply if you did before, or if you no longer apply if you didn't before. So there's a lot of different situations that this could play out. This could cause a new instance to be created because it applies now. It could cause an instance to go away if it no longer applies. It could cause an instance to remain if you used to apply and you still do, and things of that nature. They could even destroy the instance and then create a new one later. Now, one of the side effects of this is, as I mentioned, all of the methods no longer have to have that view argument on them because the view that they're associated with is specifically bound to the instance. That also means that there's one instance of this for every view. So if you need to keep any sort of state between one event and the next, you can do it very easily in a view event listener because you can just store an instance variable in your instance of this event listener, and there'll be one for every view. They're automatically kept segregated by Python by the dint of that particular multiple instance thing. This also allows you to pre-filter things. For example, if we had a series of events that we only want to trigger in a Python file, we could do what onModified is doing by checking every time and creating an event listener. Or we could use a view event listener, say that we're only applying to files of that particular type, in this case, python.sublime syntax. And as a result of that, all the methods in the class no longer need to check because they implicitly know we must apply because otherwise we wouldn't be called. A potential downside to a view event listener is that not all events are available. For example, there is an event called onWindowCommand that will trigger when a window command is about to be executed. That event will trigger in an event listener because that handles any and all events. That event won't trigger in a view event listener because a view can't run a window command, only a window can. So there are some events that you can't get at as a result of this. So as a recap, we might say that you would use an event listener versus a view event listener depending on whether you want to keep state between invocations, whether you want to do that pre-filtering. It can also be more performant. If we wanted to have onModified only trigger for Python files, we might want to use a view event listener because the method will only ever be called when we're inside of a view event listener versus the top one, which will be invoked for every modification made to any view everywhere. And remember, every file is a view, every input widget is a view. That's a lot of potential times that this triggers if that matters to you. But we do have this saying here that my Python event listener is applying to any file of type that has the python.sublime syntax in its syntax setting, i.e. it is a Python file. We can't use the same thing that we used in onModified above on line 10 because we don't have a view to match against. That's why we have to use the setting here. But the onClose method mentions that this will trigger and display a dialog box telling you that a file is closing. Now this tab is still sitting over here and it is of type HTML. So if I was to close this and say I don't want to save changes, we don't see any dialog box here, which makes sense because it wasn't a Python file. This didn't apply. But if I was to create a new tab, because of the other event listener, this is Python. We can verify that by pushing space and having the first event listener trigger and say modify to Python file. Now when I close this one, it asks me, do I want to save the changes? I say no, but the event does trigger to say that it is closing a Python file. Now, to recap what we covered in today's lesson, a command in Sublime Text allows the user to take a particular action. Sometimes, though, you want to have a reaction to something that's already happening. And to do that, you would listen for an event by creating what we refer to as an event listener. There's a large number of events available for us to listen to, and there's more coming in upcoming builds of Sublime Text. In order to create an event listener, you define a class inside of your plugin with a very specific base class that tells Sublime that your class represents an event listener. The name of the class doesn't matter because Sublime's going to be in charge of creating instances of that class and invoking its methods, and that's never done by name. Now, the event listener class will only ever have one instance of itself created, and it is possible to listen for any event that exists in the Sublime Text environment. The downside of this, however, is that if you only want to listen to some events some of the time, you have to do manual filtering for that yourself. The other type of listener you can create is a view event listener. In this type of event listener, one instance will be created for every view to which it applies, and it's up to you to tell Sublime in what situations and what file types your event listener applies. The downside to this is that only events related to a view can trigger inside of a view event listener. But because there's one instance of that, that means that you can store instance specific data to store state in between events while they're happening. And your code can be smaller and more concise because all of the events that you're handling will always know that they apply. They don't need to do that on a case by case basis. Now, when it actually comes to that list of events that we can handle, and there's a large number of those, again, with more of them coming in future builds, that's something we're going to kick down the road to the next lesson in the Plugin 101 video series. So if you haven't already done so, you might want to use those buttons down below to thumb subscribe and share and ring the bell notification icon, and that'll make sure that YouTube tells you when those lessons become available. Until they do, though, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.